We thank the briefers for the information that they have provided. The ratcheting up of accusations of Russian service personnel committing crimes of a sexual nature since the very beginning of our special military operation in Ukraine has become a favorite tactic of the Kiev regime and our Western colleagues. We all recall how in the Ukrainian and Western media and also in this room, our soldiers were repeatedly accused of sexual violence with reference to certain reports containing allegedly reliable data. However, no evidence was provided. Just like today, we've not heard a single example from the briefers and those who've taken the floor, the delegations. But similar allegations fit very well into the image that was meticulously created by Western political scientists of Russian soldiers as beasts and coarse barbarians, just like Goebbels' people did towards the end of the Second World War. You'll probably recall how the PR of Ukraine, using this same Nazi method, told us how Russia's soldiers, when they were leaving Bucha, looted household goods and toilets because in Russia, a lot of people don't have toilets. That's a quote. The staging in Bucha, on the subject of which our British colleagues so much did not want to convene the Security Council upon our request, ended up being the apogee of this mendacious and unfounded PR campaign. Today, we have heard so many inconsistencies and refutations of the official version that our Western partners are now very cautious of mentioning it at all. And unfounded accusations of sexual violence are not decreasing in number, as we have seen once again today. I would like to turn to colleagues that today have become particularly indignant on this subject. I would invite you to be cautious because for these sorts of allegations by Kiev, there is absolutely there isn't the necessary evidentiary basis. This was proved very well the other day, not by just anyone, but the Ukrainian ombudsperson for human rights herself, Ms. Denisova. She, as it were, did her job a little too well and was fired by the Ukrainian regime using interesting wording. An unfathomable concentration on the numerous detailed cases of sexual crimes and raped children on the occupied territories which could not be confirmed by evidence. In other words, the Ukrainian ombudsman, without evidence, has been lying to the entire world this entire time, which was shocking even for the Kiev authorities. Those who, due to inertia, have once again made accusations against Russian soldiers today, I would like to ask you to think again about whether you can rely on the information, or rather disinformation, being circulated by Kiev. And it's not just about Denisova. A lot of cases of alleged sexual violence, which at the behest of the Kiev regime's propaganda machine have been repeated by many Western media outlets, have already been refuted by officials or by the alleged victims themselves. For example, the authorities of Kherson reported that there is no evidence that the Russian army had used sexual violence against 11 female residents of the city, as was reported by several dubious internet platforms. Nastya Savchishina, a news hero known around the world under the headline "The Woman Who Was Raped and Killed by Russians Just Because She's Ukrainian," herself admitted that she was absolutely fine and it was only something to do with a somewhat strange photography session. Another example, a girl who, according to the advisor of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Alexei Arestovich, was not only abused but also mocked by Russian soldiers in Gostomel, died. However, this did not take in Gostomel, but in Mariupol, and the criminals were not Russians, but neo-Nazis from the Azov battalion, and there is evidence of this crime. While our opponents are only making baseless accusations, I will provide you with concrete examples of the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists. According to information from the Investigative Committee of Russia, a criminal case has been launched in respect of the Deputy Commander of the Firing Brigade for Educational Work of the Military Unit A-2777 of the 36th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Marines, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Batinsky, who committed an absolutely monstrous crime. At the beginning of April, in Mariupol, Ukrainian soldiers from this brigade detained on suspicion of separatism and put them into a cellar. Later, while drunk, Batinsky threatened her with murder and raped her in the presence of her husband. When the man tried to stop this crime from taking place, the Ukrainian soldier shot him in front of his wife. Batinsky admitted to doing this in a video interview which is widely available. On the 7th of March, near the Kommunar mine in the Donetsk region, DPR service personnel clearing mines from the area discovered a storage facility containing the bodies of 4 women. The forensic report indicated that before they were killed, they were tortured and raped. One of them was pregnant. In this area was where the Aidar Nationalist Battalion was based. On the 28th of March, Nazis from the Azov Battalion in the number 18 school building in Mariupol raped and tortured a woman to death. Her disfigured body with severed hands and a swastika burned on her belly shocked the world, and we mentioned this tragedy at the meeting on the 11th of April. Currently, on the liberated territories of Ukraine, the DPR and the LPR, work is being done to identify cases and evidence of Ukrainian army crimes. They are being documented by the investigative bodies of Russia and the Donbas republics. Mr. President, Ukrainian nationalists are infamous for their cruelty, but they also contain units whose barbarity, even in the eyes of the Kiev authorities, have exceeded all acceptable bounds. In the summer of 2015, in Ukraine, a scandal emerged around the Tornado Nationalist Battalion. The Ukrainian authorities accused its fighters of looting, torture, violence against men and women, pedophilia, murder, and the abduction of Ukrainian civilians. Many of the guilty parties were prosecuted at the time, including the battalion commander Anishenko. However, in March of this year, all of these criminals were amnestied by President Zelensky. After nearly 2,500 fighters from the neo-Nazi nationalist Azov battalion and Ukrainian army service personnel surrendered in Mariupol, having ended their pointless resistance in the Azovstal plant, an investigation of the crimes they committed is being conducted. An active role is being played in this by the residents of liberated Mariupol. Soon, the international community will learn the full truth about these crimes, including crimes of a sexual nature committed by Ukrainian nationalist units and the Ukrainian armed forces, that the Kiev authorities and their Western sponsors are trying to glorify. There is numerous evidence of how these lowlives fired at civilians, doctors, volunteers who were trying to provide assistance to the wounded. Ukrainian tanks and artillery fired at point-blank range on residential buildings, and the orders from commanders to this effect were mentioned by the Azovstal prisoners, and they also hid in a residential building from the shelling of Russian armed forces. The Azov battalion members did not allow the wounded to leave hospitals, set fire to buildings, and intimidated and mocked civilians. In Mariupol, a burial of as many as 300 bodies was discovered, where, according to witnesses, the Azov fighters took the bodies of people that had died they had killed in the period when they controlled the city. Mr. President, the conflict in Ukraine has intensified the industry of Ukrainian refugees being exploited on the territory of European countries, and Ms. Patton talked about that today. Judging by the available information, the relevant EU agencies assess the threat of trafficking of Ukrainian refugees as extremely high, given the fact that in recent years Ukraine has been among the top 5 countries in terms of the number of victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in the countries of Europe. It's important to not lose sight of this problem and to not allow violence and exploitation of refugees in European countries. And the way that the long-suffering refugee women from Ukraine are being greeted in the West is no secret to anyone. In Las Vegas, posters have emerged inviting people to casting sessions for Ukrainian strippers. And in Germany, the fast food chain KFC, in its advertising, had a sign over a bed saying, "We're happy to welcome all the chicks from Ukraine." It's hard to believe that this is just harmless advertising. Clearly, this is just the tip of the iceberg, demonstrating how great the threat of sexual exploitation of Ukrainian refugees in the West is. We have all seen the widely available horrible images on the internet of the sadistic treatment of Russian prisoners and prisoners of war by Ukrainian forces. This cruelty is something that Ukrainian nationalists are also showing towards the civilian population in Donbass and the southeast of Ukraine in general, who for them are merely separatists who in 2014 made their choice in favor of autonomy from the Maidan authorities. This same treatment is reserved for women that the Ukrainian cutthroats do not feel it necessary to spare. Mr. President, I would once again like to categorically refute any accusations against Russian service personnel of sexual violence. We roundly condemn this lie. With full responsibility, I would like to declare that the actions of Russian forces are subject to strict rules, and for torture and violence against civilians, the strictest treatment is reserved. Upholding the norms of international humanitarian law is an unquestioned priority for us. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the service personnel of the Ukrainian armed forces and the nationalist battalions. So, if you genuinely want to combat the practice of sexual crimes in Ukraine, do not allow the many facts of these crimes committed by Ukrainian forces to go unnoticed, even if for political considerations might encourage you to ignore such shameful practices. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to address subjects as well that are not directly linked to the subject of today's meeting. We have taken note of the intention of the USA and the United Kingdom to supply long-range artillery and multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine. Leaving aside the entirely unconvincing explanations of such an irresponsible step, I would like to point out that the Kiev regime has already taken this as carte blanche to continue and intensify the shelling of civilian targets in Donbass, where, after a number of recent defeats, the Ukrainian artillery was no longer able to reach. The recent American munitions that were recently delivered to the Ukrainian armed forces are already being used to attack Donbass, including schools and other educational facilities. There are casualties, including among children, and we already spoke about this at the meeting on the 2nd of June. There is no military expediency for this sort of shelling, and Kiev knows this fully. Did you know that your countries are becoming directly complicit in the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces in Donbass with all the attendant consequences? The fact that there are no limits to the use of these long-range artillery and MLRSs in the eyes of the Kiev regime is demonstrated by the recent statements of their representatives, which deviate from the assertions that there are restrictions in place that have been made from Washington and London. Against this backdrop, these statements by a number of Western officials, in particular the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, to the effect that Kiev will not use American MLRSs against targets on the territory of Russia, do not sound convincing. Thus, the head of the US Secretary of State is essentially trying to legalize Ukrainian armed forces strikes on the territory of the DPR and the LPR that are killing civilians, including children. In this connection, we not only reserve the right to move the line of threat that neo-Nazis pose to the Russian Federation and the Donbas republics to include the possible range of these new long-range munitions, but also to launch strikes on the centers where decisions are made, the criminal decisions are made to use these forms of weapons. I also have to note that thanks to the well-known incredible corruption of Ukrainian officials, the arms being supplied from America and Europe are openly being sold on the Ukrainian black market. A very simple internet search will show you that American Stingers are being sold for $7,000 a piece and Javelins for $30,000 each. The choice of Western firearms and ammunition is simply skyrocketing. Of course, these sales won't be missed out on by international terrorists, including those that act in Europe and America. Therefore, a warning: when your own citizens start to ask you uncomfortable questions, don't try to shift the blame onto us. Thank you.